All right, hey folks, we're on to chapter 6 now. This is our video on chapter 6, which covers a topic known in economics as elasticity. Just to give you a heads up, chapters 4, 5, and 6 are going to be on quiz 2 together. So in chapters 4 and 5, we discussed supply and demand. In chapter 6, we're going to talk about elasticity of supply and elasticity of demand. So those three chapters will all be on quiz 2 together, even though we're covering chapters 6 and 7 in this week of the course. So elasticity, as you can see from the pictures, if you think kind of like a rubber band, if you pull it back so far and let go, it reacts in the opposite direction. So elasticity has to do with responses of one variable based on changes in another variable. So there are several elasticities in the field of economics, but we're only going to talk about two: price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of supply. And since there are only two, I'll usually just drop the price from that title, and we'll call them elasticity of demand and elasticity of supply. So in a general sense, what elasticity of demand measures is it's a measure of buyers' sensitivity to price changes. So the law of demand, which we studied last week, tells us that as the price of something goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. But now we're asking, by how much does it go down? Okay, so there's some types of goods and services where the price can go up and the quantity demanded doesn't change much at all. Basically, people keep buying it even as the price goes up. There's some goods and services where when the price goes up, everybody quits buying it. So that's kind of what elasticity is all about. So we have sort of two categories, inelastic demand and elastic demand. So inelastic means that buyers are not very responsive to price changes. Good examples of that would be things like cigarettes, alcohol, heating oil, gasoline. Right? If you think about it, if you use any of those things, when the prices go up, you pretty much are guaranteed you're going to keep buying them. People don't just quit smoking because the prices went up a little bit. You don't quit heating your house because heating oil went up in price. So those are things that have inelastic demand, meaning anytime the price increases, the quantity demanded might decrease, but very, very little. Things with elastic demand are things where buyers are very responsive to price changes. So I got some examples down there, like a Snickers bar, or a certain brand of bread or chips. You know, if your favorite brand of Doritos goes up in price a little bit, you got a million other kinds of junky chips you can choose from, so you might just buy something different. So things like that might have more elastic demand. So here's some general rules that we can use to figure out what types of products are going to have elastic versus inelastic demand. So demand tends to be more inelastic if there are few good substitutes available. So again, go back to things like gas, heating oil, cigarettes. You know, if you're a smoker and you're addicted to cigarettes, there aren't a lot of good substitutes for that. The proportion of the household budget spent on the item is relatively small. So the trick there is, you know, if you only spend a fairly small amount of your income on something, you don't worry too much about a 10% increase in price, right? I mean, a pack of cigarettes is what, $5, $6? I don't know. I don't smoke at all, never have. But you know, something that costs $6 goes up by 10%. It's not that big a deal, so it's not that big a hit. Compare that with something like your rent or the price of a house, right? If a $300,000 house goes up by 10%, that's a big deal. That's going to make you more responsive to the price change. And then whether we're looking at a short time period or a long time period, in the shorter time period, demand tends to be more inelastic. That's because there's less time for you to find substitutes and make adjustments. Good example would be going back to heating oil, right? If you heat your house with heating oil and the price of heating oil goes up, you probably keep buying the stuff. But if that price stays high for a long time, maybe you switch your heating system away from heating oil to some cheaper way of heating the house. And then vice versa. So all these things are true in the opposite direction. If there are lots of good substitutes available, demand tends to be elastic. If the proportion of your budget spent on the item is large, it tends to be elastic. If we're looking at the longer time period as opposed to shorter, demand tends to be elastic. So those are kind of our general rules of thumb. So you can start thinking of goods and services in that way and try to figure out whether demand is elastic or inelastic. Now, if we want to be more precise about it, you can calculate elasticity of demand using math. And the formula for that's pretty simple. E subscript D, which you see on the screen, that's elasticity of demand, is just the percent change in the quantity demanded divided by the percent change in price. So if you have data showing you a certain change in price, you figure out, all right, if that's a 10% change in price, how much does the quantity demanded change? Divide those two out, that's your elasticity of demand. And then the way to interpret the number, you're just going to get a simple number. If you get a number that's less than 1.0 in absolute value, that tells you the demand is inelastic, because what that means is whatever the change in price was, the change in quantity demand had to be less than that. That's how you get that fraction to work out less than 1. If you get elasticity of demand equal to 1.0, actually equal to negative 1.0, but we'll take the absolute value, that's unit elastic. If elasticity's absolute value is greater than 1.0, that means demand is elastic. So those are the rules of thumb. Those are described in the book as well, but that's how you interpret those. Now let's look at an example. Going back to our example of cigarettes, if the price of cigarettes increases by 10%, let's just say you found some data and you found that the quantity demanded, the actual quantity of cigarettes purchased, decreased by 5%. So you plug those into our formula, E sub D, and percent change in Q over percent change in P gives you negative 0.5. So I told you to just look at the absolute value because elasticity of demand should always be negative. And that is due to the law of demand, because the law of demand tells us as price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, and vice versa. So these two numbers should always be moving in opposite directions. So economists just know that and expect it and don't even worry about it. You just look at the actual number. So 0.5 is a number less than 1.0. That tells us that cigarettes have inelastic demand. Now there's a question at the bottom just to make you think, what would happen in this case to total revenue at cigarette companies? Total revenue is just price times quantity. So think about it. If your price goes up by 10% and you only lose 5% of your sales, what do you think happens to total revenue? I think there's some examples in one of the exercises to make you think through that for different elasticities and different kinds of situations. But that's basically the math on elasticity of demand. If you need a refresher on how to calculate percent change, I think those are also covered in the study guides for this chapter. Okay, couple of graphs here. So the graph on the left, it says has relatively inelastic demand. One on the right has relatively elastic demand. I could work you through the math, but if you just kind of look at it and think for a second about the relative percent changes in Q and P, that should make sense. But the main point here is when the slope of the demand curve is steeper, like the one on the left, that tends to show inelastic demand. If it's relatively flat, like the one on the right, that tends to be more elastic demand. So that's another little helpful hint. Then these are all kind of rare oddball cases of demand curves with constant elasticity of demand. On most demand curves, the elasticity changes at different points along the curve, but on these, it's constant. So these are kind of special cases. The one on the left shows perfectly inelastic demand. What that would mean is no matter what the price, the same quantity is purchased. It's hard to come up with examples of that, but maybe something like a class where the textbook is required. If there are 20 students in the class and they're all required to buy the textbook, then they're going to buy it no matter the price, I guess, in theory at least. The one on the right shows an elasticity of infinity, which is perfectly elastic demand, which is even more hard to interpret. It's really kind of just an extreme case, I guess, so let's not even really worry about that. Just remember the lesson about the slope. Steeper slope equals more elastic demand. So I think I'm going to stop it there, and I'll make another video about price elasticity of supply. So, forgot how to get out of here. There we go.